Afternoon and welcome. I'm Renda Slim, Director of the Program on Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues at the Middle East Institute. We are very pleased that you have joined us for this expert discussions on Iraq. The Conflict Management Program at Johns Hopkins SAIS is co-sponsors of today's program. And the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, with which I'm affiliated, is also represented on the panels. We are recording this event and will post video and podcast of the content on the website mei.edu. Please silence your mobile devices. We encourage you to tweet about the event. As many of you know, I am an avid tweeter or tweep, and ask that you use the hashtag IraqMEI. I would like to call your attention to MEI's annual award banquet and conference, which are coming up on November 14 and 15. We will honor Sheikha Hussa Sabah of Kuwait and philanthropist Fadi Ghandour at the banquet, and we have a terrific slate of panelists the next day. Please see the MEI website to buy your banquet tickets and register for the conference, which is free and open to all. Now, let's turn to today's event. We are honored to have the senior-most State Department official responsible solely for Iraq policy, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Joseph Pennington, to open our program. Two expert panels will follow him. My SAIS and MEI colleague, Dr. Daniel Serwer, and I will introduce our respective panels in turn. Each session will include time for audience question, but we will try to close promptly by 4:30 this afternoon. You have our keynote speaker's professional biography in your program booklet. I will say simply that he's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service of the United States. He began his current assignment as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq in December 2015, after having served as the Director of the Office of Iraq Affairs, after returning from a 2-year assignment as Consul General at the U.S. Consulate General in Erbil. He has over 2 decades of experience in regions experiencing or recovering from conflict, both in the Middle East and in the Balkans. We are looking forward to hearing his perspective on the domestic and regional challenges facing Iraq, the U.S. interests at stake, and U.S. policy. This gathering could not have been more timely. We have witnessed the developments in the last few days in Kirkuk. Iraq's old problems are back to the fore after having been sidestepped by the fight against ISIS. As this fight starts winding down, new old issues are re-entering the political space on force and pose new threats to the long-term security and stability of Iraq. I imagine our esteemed speaker has plenty to say about these recent developments, and we can explore them further with him in the question and answer segment. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joseph Pennington.
Thank you very much, Rhonda, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to first thank the Middle East Institute for organizing this conference today, to SAIS for hosting it, and for the invitation for me to speak. It's obviously a very timely, and I think the number of friends who are going to be speaking on the panels, I hope I can stay around for some of those. We have others from my office who will be here for others, but it should be a really good discussion. In my remarks, what I would try to limit myself to 15, maybe a little more than 15 minutes, and really leave the bulk of the time for discussion, for question and answer. And just up front, the events of the last several days, I will touch on at the end of my remarks briefly, but mostly we'll leave those to question and answer. I really want to address the broader themes of Iraq, U.S. interests in Iraq, our policy in Iraq, and sort of raise perhaps some issues and questions to be followed up by the panels. But really do want to leave the bulk of the time for what should be an interesting discussion. In 2014, all of us witnessed a scourge that nearly destroyed Iraq's political compact. As our Consul General in Erbil at that time, I got a closer look at this than most of you here today, except perhaps our Iraqi and Iraqi Kurdish friends. I will never forget the moment, in fact, when I was standing in my little living room on our compound in Erbil, and Brett McGurk was standing with me. We were about to go off to a meeting with the region's vice president, Khosrat Rasul, and I got a call on my cell phone to alert me that Mosul had fallen to ISIS. I mentioned that to Brett, and of course we immediately canceled our meeting, reoriented our day to begin what came over the next weeks and months to be a process of establishing the partnerships in Baghdad and Erbil with the United States, and ultimately what became the coalition that enabled the progress that we've seen in the past 3 years against ISIS, which I will mention. But that moment is etched in my mind, and all that followed, of course, including ISIS's efforts to capture large parts of Iraq, even to Baghdad, and its move toward Erbil. But during that summer, ISIS's capture of vast areas of Iraq threatened the very idea of Iraq. The so-called caliphate offered a barbaric and despotic system that paid no respect to Iraq's millennia of vital contributions to human civilization. ISIS thrust into northern Iraq, ripped apart the rich fabric of Iraq's ancient minority communities in the Nineveh Plain. Its forces threatened Baghdad, threatened Erbil and the south before being repulsed and settling into an occupation of large areas in the provinces of Nineveh, Diyala, Anbar, and Salahuddin. 3 years later, as ISIS grows ever weaker in Iraq, Iraqis now have an opportunity to forge a new way ahead, to develop a politics that is responsible to the needs of Iraqi citizens and puts the country on a more confident path toward lasting stability. But what does that kind of Iraq actually look like? Well, what Iraq's constitution envisions and what we are working to support is a united, prosperous, stable, federal, democratic Iraq, one that is inclusive of its ethnic and religious diversity, an Iraq at peace with itself, at peace with its neighbors, and an Iraq that rejects terrorism and is capable of combating it. These key objectives are also very much in the United States' national interest, and we are working hard to achieve them. They are also critical to achieving a sustainable Iraqi political compact. Today, I want to focus on what the U.S. government is doing to advance these goals, the Iraqi political context we are operating in, and the most urgent challenges we face in this endeavor. The Defeat ISIS campaign continues to progress toward wresting all the remaining parts of Iraqi territory out of ISIS' hands. In that context, I think it's especially notable that Iraqis have been in the forefront of this fight. And when I say Iraqis, it is understood I mean Iraqis of all stripes, Kurds, non-Kurds, Iraqis. Iraqi troops have done the bulk of the fighting against ISIS, a positive development given how thoroughly ISIS routed the Iraqi army back in 2014. They have taken significant casualties in military operations, Peshmerga, Iraqi security forces. This does not mean the struggle is over, of course, because truly defeating ISIS, as we all know, requires more than battlefield success. Ensuring that Iraqi internally displaced persons can return to their homes in areas liberated from ISIS control is an immediate need and is key to stabilizing Iraq. We are seeing some encouraging results on this front. Mosul, the capital of ISIS' so-called caliphate in Iraq, or presence in Iraq, saw fierce fighting that heavily damaged the city. The fighting that dislodged ISIS from its center of control in western Mosul was especially disruptive and reduced much of the city to rubble. Indeed, 800,000 residents of Mosul remain displaced. But with support from all members of our coalition, including a $265 million commitment from the United States, residents in liberated areas, including Mosul, are working to rebuild their communities, and many have already returned. Even in Mosul, 366 Iraq-led, UN-implemented, coalition-funded stabilization projects are already underway. This is part of a larger number, 1,240 such projects that are underway throughout the country. These projects have already facilitated the safe and voluntary return of nearly 300,000 people to Mosul alone. Nationwide, the UN Development Program, UNDP, has used funds provided by coalition partners, including the United States, to restore basic services and livelihoods in areas liberated from ISIS. These projects, in support of Iraqi efforts, have facilitated the return of more than 2.2 million displaced persons. Because of ISIS' deliberate targeting of Iraqi civilians through improvised explosive devices and booby traps in homes and public buildings, demining remains a fundamental element of our stabilization program. US-funded demining teams are working in Nineveh to clear critical infrastructure, a prerequisite for increased returns of displaced populations. As a result of US efforts in this area, over 40 tons of explosive hazards have been cleared throughout Iraq. So far in 2017, we have provided approximately $48 million in support of demining operations, resulting in the clearance of over 3.8 million square miles of land, the destruction of more than 10,500 landmines, unexploded ordnance, and IEDs. We've also educated more than 38,500 Iraqi men, women, and children about the potential dangers from landmines and unexploded ordnance in their communities. As stabilization efforts move forward and active military operations against ISIS wind down, we envision a steep decline in the number of Iraqi IDPs in the coming year. In fact, the Iraqi government is already turning its attention to the even more complex issue of the country's long-term reconstruction. And the costs of reconstruction, variously estimated at tens of billions of dollars and perhaps even higher than that, are far more than the Iraqi state, even with the support of its international partners, can bear. While the United States continues to urge regional partners and donor countries to contribute to this effort, reconstruction on such an enormous scale will not be possible without unlocking the capacity of Iraq's private sector. In order to attract the private investment that Iraq requires, Iraq, of course, will need to improve its regulatory and investment climate and address the rampant corruption that plagues its economy. Indeed, Iraq's fiscal situation remains troubled, but has shown significant improvement since the 2016 G7 summit in Japan, where key coalition partners, including the United States, stepped into support. Iraq continues to abide by the terms that the IMF requires to meet its obligations under the standby arrangement. The IMF agreement also forces Iraq to take tough measures to implement much-needed public sector reforms, to reduce spending, and find ways to generate non-tax revenue streams. The World Bank has a third and final tranche of a development policy loan set to transfer to Iraq this December, also tied to structural economic reform. The bank is now looking toward moving past stabilization and into post-ISIS reconstruction. On the political side, there are reasons for hope that Iraq is in fact moving in the right direction to build on and sustain the success achieved in the effort to defeat ISIS and return life to liberated communities. Iraqis are increasingly seeing that their problems require national solutions, which means that there are now enhanced prospects for cross-sectarian coalitions before or after the upcoming general election. Moving beyond a sectarian political framework would give all Iraqis more of a stake in the Iraqi state. Merely being Sunni or Shia is no longer enough to command the support of constituents. Leaders must have something to show for it, and what we've seen from the Iraqi people is a demand for better governance. Social media, in fact, are filled with postings from Iraqis calling for better government. Their demands are couched not in sectarian terms in most cases, but in practical ones. An end to corruption, a better standard of living, leaders that care more about the Iraqi people than about lining their pockets, and a state that is effective enough to provide that most basic need, security, and is able to stop suicide bombings and prevent a group like ISIS from ever again presenting such an existential threat to the Iraqi state. Progress towards less sectarian politics is especially crucial to blunt the future of appeal of ISIS and other Sunni extremist groups that are fueled by the politics of grievance and alienation. Iraq's provincial and national elections, both scheduled for early 2018, will reveal whether any of these potentially positive trends are turned into enduring features of Iraq's political landscape. For that to happen, Iraq will first need to overcome legal and institutional obstacles that stand in the way of a smooth election process. The election law, which details the date of the election, how and where votes will be counted, and other technicalities, remains stuck in Parliament because members are trying to tailor the law to fit their political interests. Iraq has also failed so far to elect new members to the Independent High Election Commission, IHEC. As with the elections law, the voting on IHEC members is mired in political bickering. The longer the IHEC standoff drags on, the more likely it is to become a flashpoint for internal political strife. And of course, once IHEC, the new IHEC, is in place, it will need to focus on the critical issue of inclusive participation of all Iraqis, including those who remain displaced. Once Iraq surmounts the technical hurdles to the election, another challenge will be the role of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, who have been central to Iraq's military victories against ISIS, and whether they participate in this election or through their proxies. The PMF remains popular in Iraq. Much of that organization, as you know, is made up of volunteers who responded to Grand Ayatollah Sistani's fatwa and mobilized to defend Baghdad when ISIS threatened the capital in the summer of 2014. However, the PMF also includes a number of well-known groups that are highly problematic and heavily influenced by Iran. Some of these groups were responsible for killing American forces in the years after 2003 and are unlikely to submit fully to Baghdad's control. We know that some of the most problematic groups close to Iran are interested in running for office or having their proxies run for office in Iraq's next national elections. And if they win or do well, they will almost certainly adopt political positions that are sectarian and beholden to Tehran. Whether as a political actor or a security organization, these parts of the PMF will likely present a major challenge to the Iraqi state post-ISIS. As you know, rolling back that Iranian influence is a major goal of the Trump administration. And the best way, we believe, to push back Iran in Iraq is by bolstering the Iraqi state politically and economically. Iraq and Iran will always have an important relationship, given their geographic proximity, linked economies, and shared elements of their history. But U.S. support for strengthening the Iraqi state, connecting Iraq to Western institutions, and, over the longer term, developing the economic and commercial ties that offer Iraqis access to Western technology, Western investment, and Western business practices will help reduce the appeal of the worst aspects of the Iranian state's ideology. No Iraqi leader aspires to be the vassal of another state, and I've never met an Iraqi who wants to be ruled from Tehran. Some of the real and organic differences between Iran and Iraq will persist into the future, no matter who is in charge. For now, a hopeful sign is that Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi's instincts seem well suited to forging a politics that is more inclusive, including of Sunnis and smaller minorities, and to creating the sort of political arrangement that is ultimately going to be more stable. During major combat operations against ISIS, the Prime Minister stressed that Iraqi forces must be accountable, must not commit human rights violations, particularly against Sunnis, because the areas liberated were majority Sunnis. The track record was not perfect, but we saw significant progress toward greater accountability and a willingness to take reports of abuses seriously. In areas that Iraqi forces liberated from ISIS control, the Prime Minister insisted on working the humanitarian and stabilization issues through the locally elected authorities. In most cases, these were Sunnis. These approaches and the liberation process itself were noticed by Iraqi Sunnis whose level of trust in the Prime Minister and in central government institutions is on the rise. Prime Minister Abadi's more inclusive instincts are also playing out in Iraq's regional relationships. Prime Minister came to office pledging to pursue better relations with Iraq's Arab neighbors and has gained some significant traction in this regard. Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Jubair visited Baghdad in February of this year, the first time a senior Saudi official has traveled to Iraq since the eve of the Gulf War in 1990. This opened the way for the Prime Minister's reciprocal trip to Saudi Arabia in June. The two countries are now starting to work together to keep terrorists from traversing their shared borders, while ensuring that those borders remain open for increased trade. They have already opened one border crossing point, and discussions about a second border point opening are underway. Last Monday, Saudi Arabia's cabinet took the important step of establishing a joint cooperation council to advance bilateral security and economic interests with Iraq. Progress continued last week with the Saudi Arabian Airlines announcement that in a few weeks it will begin flights from the kingdom to several cities in Iraq. Again, first time in 27 years. On the Iraq-Jordan border, the Traybil border crossing is now open for the first time since the incursion of ISIS, and we are working to help the Iraqis develop this important overland trade route. This, together with the positive development in Saudi relations with the Gulf more broadly, has the potential to boost trade and economic development in Iraq's mostly Sunni Anbar province and other areas. The prospect of better economic opportunities, of course, would give Iraqi Sunnis more of a stake in the Iraqi state and reduce the appeal of extremist groups' empty promises of a better future than what the state can provide. Kuwait has announced that it will hold a reconstruction conference early in 2018 to bring together donors that can help bolster Iraq economically, and that will build on U.S. efforts to marshal World Bank and IMF support for Iraq that I described earlier. Through these efforts, Iraq is well on its way to regain its important role in the broader region, a process that will, over time, I believe, serve to balance Iraq's foreign relations. Of course, the Iraqi state, and the picture I've described, faces significant challenges as Iraq strives to improve security and stability. The most immediate challenge, of course, is the Kurdistan regional government's independence referendum, which the Kurds held on September 25th in the face of opposition from Baghdad, the United States, and nearly the entire international community. We continue to believe that a strong, independent, unified Iraq would best provide the security and stability needed for a sustainable Iraqi future. As is well known, we urged the Kurdistan region's president, Masoud Barzani, not to proceed with the referendum and to instead pursue serious and sustained dialogue with the central government within the framework of the Iraqi constitution. We offered to broker those discussions along with the United Nations to achieve concrete progress toward resolving the outstanding issues that have bedeviled Baghdad-Erbil relations since 2003, and in fact, in some cases earlier. We were especially concerned that holding the referendum in Iraq's disputed territories would be perceived as an attempt to impose a unilateral solution on a very complicated set of issues that can only be resolved through sustained, determined negotiations. The events of the past week in Kirkuk and elsewhere have shown us the potential dangers of post-referendum conflict in Iraq. Strife between Iraqi forces and the Kurds threatened to distract both sides from finishing off major combat operations against ISIS, just when that cooperation was most needed. We remain very concerned about the continuing fallout from the referendum as the central government attempts to reassert its constitutional prerogatives at borders, airports, and most significantly in the disputed territories. We are urging both sides to engage in dialogue and work towards resolving their differences peacefully. Prime Minister Abadi made clear before the referendum that if President Barzani went ahead with his plans, it would undermine their strong relationship and make negotiations untenable in a post-referendum environment. Iraq's key government institutions, the Supreme Court, its parliament, its prime minister, all continue to maintain the referendum was unconstitutional and are demanding that President Barzani annul the results. This, of course, is something that President Barzani cannot do without losing serious credibility in his own constituency, and so the impasse persists. Our efforts are aimed at finding more limited areas for progress that are both critical, at the same time feasible, deconflicting military forces and military movements, developing joint approaches to administering disputed areas, and establishing joint security mechanisms. We are urging all sides to de-escalate tension and avoid unilateral actions that could lead to confrontation or unhelpful intervention by Iraq's neighbors. While there are certainly risks in the short term, and I've identified one, we remain committed to helping bring the parties together and working with them to forge a practical return to stability. So while I end my remarks by highlighting a very serious challenge to Iraq's political compact, we should not let the current crisis overshadow the enormous strides that Iraq has made over the past 3 years toward crushing ISIS and in pursuing political and structural reforms that serve the interests of all Iraqis. I think I'll stop there. I'd be happy to take your questions.
All right. Thank you very much again for your very insightful remarks and for taking the time from, what I'm assuming, a very busy schedule to be here with us. So just following on your last remarks about what's next with respect to the Erbil-Baghdad relationship. I looked at the October 3 congressional testimony that you gave at the time, then, and in which you said that high-level negotiations on the future of Baghdad-Erbil relations may prove to be difficult in the near term. Now, and you here talked about the strategy going forward for the US in managing the fallout of the referendum, of the Kirkuk operation yesterday, is to focus on more defined sets of issues which you have identified. But there still needs to be a dialogue, you know, on the overall relationship. Who will start this? Do you see the UN, you know, taking it over? There was this offer that you referred to pre-referendum to broker this, you know, a new dialogue or to moderate a new dialogue. So what is your perspective on this going forward? Somebody needs to get these two parties to start talking about this relationship.
So first, let me just say, again, at the moment we have sort of a rolling crisis situation. This situation that has been building in the last days is still ongoing. It's not over by any means. There are new developments seemingly by the hour. Our effort for the moment and for the foreseeable future is aimed at minimizing the potential for additional confrontation, aimed at de-escalating tensions, returning to a sense of normalcy and stability that may, at some point, allow for broader issues to come into the conversation. But frankly, I think that to expect the Prime Minister to engage in a sort of open-ended discussion of the future relationship between Baghdad and Erbil under current circumstances, and particularly as he heads into an election season, I think it will be very difficult. I would never say impossible, but the Prime Minister made it clear before the referendum that this would be the outcome, that it would make that discussion, which he was open to, make it more difficult. We said the same thing privately. We said the same thing publicly. The discussion that was available on September 24th is not available at this time. It will depend on how this crisis unfolds. It will depend on the politics heading into the election as to when the time would be right to perhaps revisit some of those issues. But for now, again, we are focused on getting through this crisis, deconflicting, and establishing a new security arrangement.
Right, thank you. Now, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it to the audience because we have a lot of Iraq experts who are in the audience who are eager to ask you questions. The second question has to do with the US-Iraq strategy. We have, going forward, ISIS, the fight against ISIS is winding down. The reports from the governments in Baghdad that by the end of this year, Iraq is expected to be liberated of ISIS. So going forward, we have heard so much about a strategy that's being put in place to help consolidate, the security gains, to help Iraq, keep the peace. There is a lot of tough work that Iraq and Iraqis have to do. They need to heal their country, and this is up to them to do that. But what is going to be the US policy post-ISIS on Iraq?
And so, thank you. I touched on some of this in my remarks. But let me just say, I think for those of you who've been doing Iraq issues, looking at Iraq issues since 2003 or even earlier, and I admittedly came to all of this late in 2000. I've only been doing this for 4.5 years, so I'm a relative newcomer. But let me just say that for those of you who remember Iraq and the Iraq-US relationship in the years immediately after 2003, we are not in that situation anymore. This is not a United States policy that is trying to impose a solution on Iraq. And so, and I was asked at the hearing that you referred to, what is the US political plan for Iraq? I had to answer. I was honest with the congressman who asked the question. I said, it's not a question of any US political plan. We've tried a US political plan, didn't work out. These are Iraqi problems. They require Iraqi solutions. All that said, of course, the United States will remain fully engaged with all of our partners across the political spectrum, with Baghdad, with Erbil, with the regions, and we facilitate discussion. We encourage progress in the direction that is, we think, the way Iraq should be going, and in fact corresponds to US interest in achieving stability, inclusiveness in Iraqi governance. But I can't stress this enough, as in the case of the counter-ISIS campaign, as has been the case in stabilization, our approach to stabilization, same in the approach to Iraqi politics. Our approach is to support. These are, again, Iraqi problems, Iraqi solutions.
Right, thank you. I'm going to open it up now for questions from the audience. We have 2 micros, and sir, first micro here. And then this is a question and answer. You ask the question, Mr. Pennington answers. So please, no comments. Thank you. Please.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former Foreign Service officer. There's something like 3 to 4 times more Kurds in the world than there are Palestinians. So I have trouble understanding why Palestine deserves a state and Kurdistan doesn't. I mean, isn't this sort of an American hubris to tell a people that they have to be chained to some other people for the rest of human history? Wouldn't we be better off getting on the right side of history and shepherding that independence?
I mean, the United States has certainly never outlined a position as you just described it. The United States has a policy, supports a united federal Iraq. We also, though, in the run-up to the referendum, offered to broker and facilitate discussions, along with our international partners, between Baghdad and Erbil of the future of that relationship. Another path was chosen, and we are now living, so we're living with the results of that. But I think our interests in Iraq are separate from the sort of the larger question that you pose. We are focused on governance in Iraq. And, unilateral actions such as the referendum, we feel, are not helpful, particularly at this point in time, to achieving the stability that is desperately needed in that region.
The lady here, please. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Nike Chin. I am the State Department correspondent for Voice of America. Yes, Pennington, thank you so much for the remarks. You addressed Kirkuk, and then we saw the statement yesterday from State Department supporting, quote, a peaceful exercise of a joint administration of all disputed areas. My question for you is, could you please elaborate on that? In your vision, what would be a stable and secure Kirkuk? Thank you.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it is. So what we were getting at in that statement is that under Iraq's constitution, the federal government, the central government, absolutely has a right to have a presence in disputed territories. Those territories, no matter whose control they have been under, they remain disputed. There is a constitutional mechanism for resolving ultimate disposition of those territories. But there is a federal prerogative to be present in the territories. And so what we said in the statement was reflective of our long-term policy, long-standing policy, that we support a joint exercise of authority in the disputed territories. Obviously, there needs, before you can get to the details of what that looks like, you need to get a stable environment to have those discussions, and you need to be able to bring people together. And so we're in the early stages of trying to get to those steps to determine what the details would look like. Again, it will be up to the government in Baghdad and the government in Erbil to work out what a joint administration with joint security arrangements will ultimately look like on the ground. But we were stating our sort of broad vision.
Yes, please. Bent. تفضل.
Thank you very much. My name is Renald Rahim. If I could reverse Renda's Slim's question, or actually the congressional question, not by asking what are U.S. plans for Iraq, but in a different way. Beyond ISIS, are there any U.S. vital national interests in Iraq? And if so, could you please identify them? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, of course there are. You've mentioned one, which
Sorry,
is...
could I just say, and I don't mean you want prosperity and happiness for the Iraqi people.
No, I will be very specific, and I will give you 4.
What's wrong with prosperity and happiness?
Although we do want.
I mean, we all desire them.
Of course, the answer is yes. In addition to defeating ISIS, which is our #1 strategic priority in Iraq, remains so today. Stability in Iraq and the broader region, obviously a vital interest. Energy resources, a continued flow of energy resources to world markets, clearly strategic U.S. interest. And the prevention of a reemergence of another ISIS 2.0, Al-Qaeda 3.0, whatever it might be. So there are several. And I would add to, and this falls under the regional stability rubric, and I mentioned it, having Iraq as a key, playing its, I guess, historic key role as part of its region is a strategic U.S. interest because it goes directly to the question of regional stability. And if I may I'll give you even more than you want. And fifth, and some might put this higher on the agenda, is constraining Iranian influence. constraining Iranian malign influence.
How does Iraq help with that?
So Iraq, again, in my view, Iraq is in a very delicate position with regard to Iran. It shares a long border with Iran. It shares history. It shares community ties. It shares certain religious ties. There are also a lot of differences, as you know, linguistically, ethnically, theologically, politically, historically. And historically, Iraq and Iran have been competitors than one playing a dominant role to the other. But I think, again, to push, when we talk about rolling back Iranian influence in Iraq, and we all agree that Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq, some of it is we would regard as very unhelpful in Iraq, is to strengthen Iraqi institutions which naturally and historically have shown that there will be pushback to Iraq, and also, of course, to increase Iraq's ties with more benevolent actors, Western actors. And that's where we get to the sort of the U.S. broader relationship with Iraq, going beyond ISIS, going beyond security into economic areas, cultural areas, investment, getting the kinds of Western influences with which Iran cannot compete in Iraq. And most Iraqis, I think, when they look to their future, they want a future that gives economic hope. That economic hope, high technology, investment, clean business practices, it's not going to come from the East.
Gentleman in the back, sitting in the last row.
Thank you. My name is Nick Riker. I'm a Middle East observer from the United Kingdom. Mr. Pennington, I think we share an interest in political economy. And many observers have said that ever since 2003, Iraq's political cohesion has been undermined by an American-inspired obsession with free market fundamentalism. And I wonder, from your background, to what extent you share any of that view, and is it still a problem today?
Well, it's a very broad question. If you look at it back to 2003, we had a certain approach, I think, back in 2003, and what Iraq's economic future should be that was perhaps clumsily rolled out and was unsuccessful. I think we can agree on that. Again, this is an Iraqi challenge that is a long-term challenge. It's not going to be an easy one to address, given the problems that I cited with not only with corruption, which is an obvious one, but a lack of exposure to Western business practices, a problem with rule of law, enforcing contracts. But there, in terms of economic policy, there's a range of policies that the Iraqi government can choose, from sort of more Wild West private sector-led, which doesn't seem to be the trend, to a kind of mixed economy. Obviously, there is a heavy state sector, and including in the energy area. But those are a range of policy options. But I think what we want to help, I think where we can be helpful to Iraq is in the more basic areas, limited areas that I just identified. Rule of law, enforcing contracts, giving businesses the confidence they need, the Western businesses, the confidence they need that if they go into Iraq, make a heavy investment, that they'll be treated fairly. Those are things that don't prejudge a highly privatized or a heavily public sector-oriented economy. So I think there are two sort of separate questions. The Iraq economic policy, totally an Iraq decision that will be played out through the political process, but areas where we can be supportive to connect Iraq to Western markets and Western investment, which won't, unless those reforms are made of the kind I described, Western companies won't go there. And so it will be a missed opportunity for Iraq.
Yes, sir.
Dan Lieberman, I'm a writer. You say that Iran has much influence, but some of it is malevolent, and they need to turn to more benevolent authorities. But aren't you being patronizing in defining these words? And aren't you really saying that the Iraqi people are not mature enough to make up their mind of what is malevolent and what is benevolent?
Perhaps if I was patronizing, I apologize. I was not meaning to be, obviously. What I'm trying to get at, maybe I phrased it clumsily, what I'm trying to get at is clearly there is an affinity for many Iraqis with many parts of Iranian society and culture, and that's not a problem. Iran, like any state, will try to exert influence in its region to advance its interests. That's to be expected. Where we get into what I would call malign influence is when it comes to steps that are taken to put pressure and coerce governments, security forces, and others into taking actions that they otherwise wouldn't take, or trying to influence events on the ground in ways that are in Iran's interest, but perhaps not in the interests of Iraq and its citizens. That's the kind of influence that we find problematic. We recognize that there will always be a normal relationship there. And when I say benevolent, probably a clumsy use of the word, but giving Iraq other opportunities. I mean, ultimately, it's up for Iraqis to choose whether they want to be more engaged with the West, with the United States, whether they want less U.S. presence. We are there on the military side, on the security side, we're there at the request of the Iraqi authorities. And whether the same thing could be said about Iran in every case, I'm not so sure. But of course, Iraqis have every right to choose how they want to develop their foreign relations and who they want to choose as their partners. What I'm saying is that I think the Western option offers many things that many Iraqis aspire to that can't be delivered by their Eastern neighbor.
Sure, please.
Hi, I'm Christopher Blanchard with the Congressional Research Service. Just a sort of factual clarification, as you're aware, the response to the events of the last 48 hours, there's a lot of speculation about Iran's role in those events. Could you offer your views on whether or not it's fruitful or accurate to view Iran as the principal author and beneficiary of those events?
Yes, my view is no. These were largely, these are Iraqi, the movements of Iraqi forces, led by, in fact, by the Counterterrorism Service, which is Iraq's best and most disciplined fighting force, in fact, US-trained force. There was, as in most Iraqi military movements, there was a mix of forces, and there certainly were some PMF forces in that mix. But I think the decision to have the CTS in front was deliberate. I think also we need to filter out some of the more alarmist things that we have seen in media, and I don't want to minimize, in fact, what has taken place. These are significant events. There have been deaths. We recognize that. These are tragic events for those cases. But on the main, what we have seen is the Iraqi government engaging in discussions with parts of the Kurdish leadership that controls the areas that they wanted to establish, in which they wanted to establish a federal presence, to make arrangements for Iraqi security forces to move into these areas and establish that presence. In most cases, they have done that in a way that has not been confrontational, that has, there are exceptions. Obviously, there are exceptions, and I say, be very clear about that. There have been isolated incidents of confrontation. But to describe this as somehow an attack against, by the Iraqis against the KRG is, in our view, not accurate. But back to your initial question, we very much see this as Iraqi movement.
A quick question on my part. There is also a lot of debate, especially in the Twitter space, about was all of this preventable? And that we have not done enough, or we came in too late, into the game. And so if you just like to comment on it, was it preventable, or the dynamics were already set by the time the offer was made?
I mean, anything is preventable, right? Because people make decisions that lead us to certain points. I would go back, I mean, I think the clearest way to have prevented this would have been, frankly, not to go forward with the referendum. The referendum having taken place, being a reality, of course, then it is, I think, we need to recognize, and we certainly foresaw, that there would be enormous pressure on the Prime Minister to respond. And we saw the resolutions passed one after the other in Parliament, calling on the Prime Minister to do a series of things, some of which were more symbolic, some of which were more active, and some of which may have even been drastic. So I think we need to see the actions that have taken place in that political context. You can't remove the political context from what has happened. And if the Prime Minister had not responded, I think we could have seen a scenario that was potentially far more disturbing than we would see now in terms of changes in Baghdad that would have been, I think, very unfortunate from an Iraqi standpoint and from a...
Yes, the gentleman there, please.
Yeah, Mohammed Al-Sulami from Arabian Gulf Center for Iranian Studies. Do you see Hashd al-Shabi is another version of Iranian Revolutionary Guard? Especially many Iranian officials started talking about creating another Revolutionary Guard in Iraq, Syria, and other places. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you probably know, the Iraqi parliament, I guess it was about a year ago, passed the Popular Mobilization Forces Law, which is essentially a very broad framework for incorporating PMF into the broader Iraqi security forces, and to ensure that they are responsible to the command and control of the commander-in-chief, the prime minister. Also to ensure that they are accountable under law, much as other parts of Iraqi security forces are accountable under law. Now, of course, the Popular Mobilization Forces encompass many, many forces. Many, as I alluded to in my remarks, are simply patriotic Iraqis responding to the Grand Ayatollah's call to come and combat ISIS at a critical moment. I think most Iraqis regard those including Sunni Iraqis, by the way, who I talk to frequently, regard those forces as legitimate Iraqi security forces. There are also these other groups, and we know their names, that were involved in killing Americans and others back after 2003, some of which are in fact designated terrorist organizations by the United States government. Those groups are, as I said, unlikely to be reconciled to Iraqi authority, heavily under the influence of Tehran. Those organizations, however the PMF law is implemented, and we're still in the implementation phase, and it's not clear how that's going to come out, those groups, I think, will remain a problem. I think when the Prime Minister was here in March, he alluded to his concerns about armed groups in a post-ISIS environment, and that armed groups that are not directly reporting to the Prime Minister, as the Iraqi security forces do, are essentially outlaw forces. And so that is a problem, a real challenge that the Iraqi authorities are going to have to face at a certain point after ISIS is defeated.
One last question. The lady here, please.
Thank you. I'm Prusha Hassan, a student, so certainly no expert. I'd like to ask about American stance on a unified Iraq going forward. I think the U.S. has established that it's looking to promote a unified Iraq, but in light of recent events in Kirkuk, it's also been established that the Kurds have not felt more marginalized, and divisiveness is an all-time high in decades. How feasible is this going forward? And if there is to be a unified Iraq with the mounting tension, what role would the Kurds play?
Yeah. So let me be clear about one thing, and I probably should have hit this harder in my remarks, but the United States is a partner of Iraq. And that means we're a partner of the government in Baghdad. We're a strong partner of the KRG. Those relationships continue. We expect that those partnerships will remain strong. Our intention is to deepen partnerships with both sides, but in an environment in which Baghdad and Erbil have a relationship that is reinforcing and that is of benefit to the citizens, whether you're in Kurdistan or whether you're in the rest of Iraq. Obviously, we are going through a period now that is very turbulent, both in those disputed areas and, frankly, in the Kurdistan region itself. So there is going to be a period of time where we're going to have to see how all of these actions and reactions play out and where things end up. Again, we are trying to very much to de-escalate, trying to find areas of dialogue, and we think establishing joint security in the disputed territories, it's been done before. There are patterns out there for doing this, is a way to start to rebuild some of that trust, that fabric between Baghdad and Erbil, recognizing that there are very raw feelings on both sides at this point. So we need to be realistic in the pace at which that can happen. We also think that both sides, both Baghdad and Erbil, have a tremendous amount of work to do in terms of governance, providing services for their citizens, providing effective leadership, and particularly as we move through an election cycle. So there are many, many issues that are on the plate of both governments. And I think, again, the long-term future and the long-term future of Baghdad-Erbil relations, Baghdad and Erbil will come back to that. I think at the moment, because of the environment, the atmosphere that has been created by this series of events, we're not in a place where that is possible now. So we put that on the shelf. They put that on the shelf. They can come back and talk about that another time. But in the meantime, trying to impress on both sides to not do things unilaterally, not simply to, whether it's a military movement, a referendum, or anything else, to do things that destabilize, that create this animus between the two sides that makes it so difficult to solve problems.
There is a lot of interest. I wish we can keep Mr. Pennington for another hour or two, but there are two terrific expert panels following this discussion with Mr. Pennington, so please stick around. At this time, I would like you to join me in thanking Mr. Pennington for joining us. Thank you.